February 13, 1983, Los Angeles Forum. Lon Rosen held the phone in his trembling hand, watching the clock move past noon. 17,000 people filled the arena. Millions more waited by their television sets, and the NBA All-Star Game's national anthem singer was nowhere to be found. Yesterday, Lionel Richie had been a no-show. Today, it was supposed to be Marvin Gaye's turn. But Marvin wasn't here either. Rosen had a backup plan. A Forum usherette he'd known since high school stood ready in the wings, vocal cords warmed, hands steady. But this was the NBA All-Star Game, one of America's most prestigious sporting nights, broadcast live to the nation. The backup plan felt like surrender. What Rosen didn't know was that 15 miles away, Marvin Gaye was fighting a war with his own reflection. He stood in his bedroom, staring at the mirror, watching a face he barely recognized anymore. The cheekbones that had made him the Prince of Motown were sharp now, cutting through skin that seemed too thin to hold them. His eyes were red, not from tears but from the sleepless nights that had become his routine. The man in the mirror looked like someone who had been losing battles for years. Marvin tried to clear his throat, attempted a few vocal runs. Nothing came out right. His voice, the instrument that had carried him through 2 decades of hits, felt foreign in his throat. He whispered to the empty room, "My voice is gone." The words disappeared into the silence of the house, absorbed by walls that had witnessed too many of his quiet defeats. This was supposed to be the day he sang America's most famous song. Instead, it felt like the day he would finally break. The year 1983 had begun with promise. Sexual Healing had climbed the charts, earning him his first Grammy Awards in over a decade. The album Midnight Love was being called his comeback masterpiece. Critics wrote about his return to form, his artistic resurrection. But comebacks, Marvin knew, were just another word for having fallen so far that any movement upwards seemed miraculous. Behind the headlines celebrating his musical rebirth lay a financial catastrophe that consumed his days and haunted his nights. The IRS had calculated his debt at $4.5 million. The number felt abstract until it became concrete, transforming into the loss of his Bel Air mansion, the forced sale of his Palm Springs retreat, the constant phone calls from lawyers who spoke in careful, measured tones about seizures and garnishments, and the possibility of federal prison. Anna Gordy, his first wife, Berry Gordy's sister, the woman who had once been his anchor in the chaos of fame, now appeared in his life only through legal documents demanding $600,000 in alimony payments. Each court filing arrived like a small death, a reminder of love that had calcified into contractual obligation. The divorce had been finalized years ago, but the financial bleeding continued. Every royalty check, every performance fee, every dollar that flowed from his music was already spoken for, divided between creditors and lawyers, and an ex-wife who deserved her share of what his success had cost them both. He was making money again, but he would never be able to keep it. Success had become a treadmill that moved faster than he could run. His second marriage to Janice Hunter had ended even more brutally. That divorce, completed in 1981, had left him with the right to see his children according to a schedule determined by courts and the obligation to pay support that reminded him monthly of his failures as a husband and father. Love had become another form of debt. The physical toll of the financial stress was visible in ways that makeup couldn't hide. Marvin had always been a perfectionist about his appearance. Understanding that image was half of what sold records. But the man looking back from mirrors these days appeared older than his 43 years. His suits hung differently on his frame. His smile, when cameras demanded it, required conscious effort. More troubling was what was happening to his voice. The instrument that had made him famous was becoming unreliable. Some mornings he woke up and couldn't hit notes that had once come effortlessly. His range, which had allowed him to slide from tender whispers to soaring falsettos, seemed to be contracting. He told himself it was temporary, stress-related, something that rest and time would repair. But rest was a luxury he couldn't afford, and time felt like an enemy. The Grammy wins had come with obligations. A tour was being planned, the Sexual Healing Tour, which would take him to cities across America, performing for audiences who expected to hear the voice they remembered from records. The prospect filled him with a dread that surprised him with its intensity. He had never enjoyed touring, but this felt different. This felt like a series of auditions where he might fail publicly, where the gap between his legend and his current reality would be exposed under stage lights. Stage fright had plagued him throughout his career, but he had always managed to overcome it once the music started. Now the anxiety began days before performances, manifesting as insomnia, loss of appetite, and a paranoia that made him check and recheck hotel room locks, peer through window blinds, and distrust the motives of everyone around him. The paranoia had no clear source. He wasn't sure if people were actually watching him or if his mind was creating threats to match his internal sense of vulnerability. Phone calls seemed to end too abruptly when he answered. Cars appeared to follow him for too many blocks before turning away. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Whether this was reality or imagination became less important than the way it made him feel, which was completely alone. His mother, Alberta, had become his only reliable comfort. But even that relationship carried guilt. She was aging, developing health problems that required attention and medical care he struggled to afford. The son who was supposed to be caring for his parents was instead borrowing money from his mother to pay for basic necessities. The reversal of roles felt like another failure to add to a list that already seemed too long to remember. Sleep brought no relief because sleep wouldn't come. Marvin would lie awake for hours, running calculations in his head. If the tour brought in a certain amount, minus the costs, minus the taxes, minus the alimony, minus the IRS payments, what would be left? The answer was always the same. Not enough, never enough. When sleep finally came, it was filled with dreams of performance disasters. He would be on stage, opening his mouth to sing, and no sound would emerge, or the wrong words would come out, or he would forget the lyrics to songs he had written himself. He would wake from these dreams with his heart pounding, needing several minutes to convince himself that he was in his own bedroom, not standing humiliated before thousands of witnesses. The invitation to sing the national anthem at the NBA All-Star Game had seemed like a gift when it first arrived. A prestigious event, good television exposure, and something he could do without the pressure of a full concert. The national anthem was familiar territory, a song he had performed many times before in more traditional arrangements. It should have been easy, but as the date approached, the assignment began to feel like a test he wasn't prepared to take. What if his voice cracked? What if he forgot the words? What if the audience could see through the polished exterior to the broken man underneath? The day before the performance, he had gone to the Forum for rehearsal with Gordon Banks, his longtime musical collaborator. They had worked out an arrangement that was different from anything he had attempted before, using a drum machine to create a rhythmic foundation that would transform the anthem from a traditional hymn into something more personal, more soulful. The rehearsal had not gone well. NBA officials had looked uncomfortable as Marvin stretched out the phrasing, extending the song well beyond its normal length. Television executives had made pointed comments about timing and broadcast schedules. Marvin had felt their disapproval like a weight on his chest, but he had also felt something else. For the first time in months, he had felt connected to his voice, to his artistry, to the possibility that he could still create something meaningful. He had gone home from the rehearsal feeling both hopeful and terrified. The arrangement was risky. It would either be remembered as brilliant or criticized as disrespectful. There would be no middle ground. That night, he hadn't slept at all. He had paced through his house, humming the anthem, running through the lyrics, adjusting the phrasing in his mind. By morning, he was exhausted and wired, running on nervous energy and the desperate hope that his voice would hold up for the 2 minutes it would take to sing the song. Standing in his bedroom now, watching the clock move past the time he should have already left for the Forum, Marvin felt the familiar paralysis that had become his response to pressure. His body didn't want to move. His mind supplied him with a dozen reasons to call and cancel. They could use the backup singer. The game would go on. No one would remember in a week, but something else was happening too. Beneath the fear and exhaustion, there was a spark of defiance. He had spent months feeling like a victim of circumstances beyond his control. This performance was something he could control. This was 2 minutes where he could be the artist he remembered being, not the debtor and ex-husband and failing man he had become. The phone rang. It was probably Rosen, calling to check on his whereabouts, maybe to panic politely about the schedule. Marvin didn't answer. Instead, he walked to his closet and pulled out his blue suit, the one that made him look like the man he used to be. He found his sunglasses, the ones that would hide the redness in his eyes and create a barrier between his private self and the public performance he was about to give. He picked up the cassette tape Gordon Banks had made of the drum track they had recorded the night before. The instrumental foundation for the most important 2 minutes of his recent career fit in his pocket. The drive to the Forum felt both endless and too short. Los Angeles traffic moved with its usual indifference to his crisis. Other drivers had no idea they were sharing the road with a man who was either driving toward his redemption or his public humiliation. Probably both. When he walked into the Forum through the main entrance, moving down the center aisle toward the court, Marvin could feel the energy in the building. This was one of the premier events in professional basketball, bringing together the best players in the world for an exhibition that was as much about entertainment as competition. The crowd was primed for something special. Television cameras were already capturing pregame footage, their red recording lights creating a constellation of surveillance that made Marvin's skin crawl with familiar paranoia. Lon Rosen spotted him immediately and rushed over, relief and panic competing for control of his expression. "Marvin, where have you been? We were about to—" Marvin didn't let him finish. He simply handed over the cassette tape and said, "This is what's going to play." His voice was quiet, barely audible over the ambient noise of the arena, but it carried an authority that stopped Rosen's questions. The tape felt warm in Marvin's hand, as if the music inside was already alive, waiting to be released. The tape was rushed to the sound engineers while Marvin made his way to a quiet corner to collect himself. He found a spot near the tunnel entrance where he could observe the arena without being observed. The sight that greeted him was overwhelming. 17,000 seats filled with expectant faces, each person carrying their own understanding of what the national anthem was supposed to sound like, what it was supposed to mean. He was about to challenge every one of those assumptions. He could see the players warming up, some of the biggest names in basketball going through their pregame routines. Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Larry Bird, Julius Erving. These were men at the peak of their abilities, performing in front of crowds because they could, because their bodies and minds were perfectly calibrated machines that delivered excellence on demand. Their confidence was visible in every movement, every practice shot, every casual interaction with teammates. Marvin envied them. He wondered what it would feel like to approach a performance with confidence instead of terror. To know that your instrument would respond the way you needed it to trust that practice and preparation would translate into success. These athletes lived in their bodies with a certainty he had lost years ago. They didn't question whether their legs would work when they needed to jump, whether their hands would cooperate when they needed to shoot. But Marvin questioned everything about his voice now, every note a gamble he wasn't sure he could win. Standing there in his blue suit and sunglasses, watching these masters of their craft prepare for their moment of glory, Marvin felt the weight of his own uncertainty. In a few minutes, he would be the only performer on that court, carrying the hopes and expectations of everyone in the arena. Unlike the athletes, he would have no teammates to rely on, no second chances if he failed. It would be just him, a microphone, and a song that meant different things to every person listening. But there was no time left for wondering. The arena lights dimmed, signaling the beginning of the pregame ceremony. Marvin walked towards center court, each step taking him closer to a moment that would either prove he still possessed the magic that had made him famous or reveal that it was gone forever. The honor guard from Edwards Air Force Base stood at attention with the American and California flags raised. The players lined up along the free throw lines, their faces showing the respectful attention that the national anthem commanded. 17,000 people rose to their feet in the traditional posture of patriotic observance. But this would not be traditional. When the drum machine beat began, it was unlike anything that had ever accompanied the national anthem at a major sporting event. The rhythm was slow, hypnotic, sensual. It transformed the arena from a temple of athletic competition into something more intimate, more personal. Marvin stepped to the microphone and began to sing. The first words, "Oh, say can you see," came out differently than he had planned. He dropped the opening, "Oh," starting instead with, "Say can you see?" And immediately the rhythm changed everything. His voice, which had felt so uncertain in his bedroom mirror, found its footing in the groove. What happened next was something that surprised everyone in the arena, including Marvin himself. The performance became less about singing the national anthem and more about inhabiting it, about finding his own story within the familiar lyrics. When he sang about the land of the free and the home of the brave, his voice carried the weight of his own struggles with freedom and courage. The crowd began to respond in ways that national anthem audiences never responded. They started clapping to the rhythm. They began swaying. Some called out encouragement as if they were in church instead of at a basketball game. In the expensive seats, Hollywood celebrities found themselves nodding to a beat they had never heard in this context. In the cheap seats, fans who had come for basketball discovered they were witnessing a musical revolution. Women in the audience began to react with an intensity that surprised everyone, including themselves. This wasn't the stiff, respectful attention that the anthem usually commanded. This was something more primal, more emotional. Some stood with their hands over their hearts, tears streaming down their faces. Others moved their bodies to the rhythm as if the song had awakened something they didn't know existed. The players on the court were experiencing their own transformation. These were men accustomed to being the center of attention, trained to focus despite crowd noise and distraction. But they found themselves completely captivated by what was happening at center court. Some began moving subtly to the beat, trying to maintain the respectful posture the moment demanded, while their bodies responded to music that seemed to bypass their conscious minds. Magic Johnson would later describe the experience. "We were two-stepping, listening to the national anthem. We were just bouncing left to right. It blew us away. We just got caught into the moment of this man." Julius Erving felt the historical significance even as it was happening. You knew it was history, but it was also hood. Pat Riley, coaching the Western Conference team that day, experienced something transcendent. "When he took off, I morphed into an American." For 2 minutes, the basketball world revolved around Marvin Gaye. Within his gravitational pull were MVPs, world champions, future Hall of Famers, and 17,000 people who forgot they were supposed to be watching a game because they were witnessing something unprecedented. As Marvin approached the climax of the song, stretching out the word brave, his voice showed both its power and its vulnerability. There was a breathiness to it, a sense that he was giving everything he had to this moment. When he exhaled, "Oh Lord, woo," the sound carried both triumph and exhaustion. For a split second after he finished, there was complete silence. Robert Parrish, the Boston Celtics center, would later describe it, like nobody could believe what they just heard. Then the eruption. 17,000 people cheering not just for patriotism, but for artistry. Players high-fived each other. The moment felt both sacred and revolutionary. The applause seemed to go on forever, wave after wave of appreciation and amazement. Some people were standing and clapping. Others were wiping tears from their eyes. The television cameras captured expressions of pure astonishment on faces throughout the crowd. Marvin stepped back from the microphone, nodded once to acknowledge the response, and walked straight off the court and out of the building. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, not from nervousness, but from the emotional expenditure of the past 2 minutes. He had given everything he had to that performance, pouring decades of pain and hope and artistic vision into a song that most people took for granted. As he moved through the tunnel toward the exit, he could still hear the crowd behind him. The cheering had evolved into something more complex, a mixture of celebration and bewilderment. He knew that some people would love what he had done and others would hate it, but he also knew that no one would forget it. Lon Rosen never saw him again that day, but he didn't need to. The work was done. What Marvin didn't know as he drove home was that he had just created one of the most influential performance moments in American sports history. His arrangement would inspire Whitney Houston's legendary Super Bowl performance 8 years later. Houston would say that Gaye's version was the only rendition of the national anthem she had ever liked. More immediately, Marvin had also created controversy. NBA Commissioner Larry O'Brien confronted Rosen during the first quarter of the game with what Rosen would later describe as a very colorful conversation about the appropriateness of the performance. Phone lines lit up with callers complaining about the liberties taken with a sacred song. But something fundamental had shifted. The national anthem would never be quite the same again. Marvin had opened a door for artistic interpretation that countless performers would walk through in the years to come. For Marvin himself, the performance represented both an ending and a beginning. It was one of his last major television appearances, marking the end of his comeback tour's promotional phase. Within months, he would begin the grueling sexual healing tour, which would expose his declining health and increasing paranoia to everyone around him. The tour would be plagued by the demons he had managed to hide during that perfect 2-minute performance at the Forum. His voice would become increasingly unreliable. His stage fright would worsen. His financial problems would multiply. By the time the tour ended in August 1983, he would be a shadow of the man who had commanded the NBA All-Star audience. He would move back into his parents' house, officially to care for his ailing mother, but really because he had nowhere else to go. The same house where his father's resentment and his own childhood traumas waited for him like patient predators. On April 1st, 1984, one day before his 45th birthday, his father would shoot him to death in that house, ending a life that had produced some of the most beautiful music in American history, but had never found peace. Looking back, the NBA All-Star performance takes on prophetic qualities. It was Marvin at his most powerful and most vulnerable, channeling everything he was feeling about freedom and bravery into a song that had never been sung with such personal investment. He sang about the land of the free while trapped in debt and addiction. He sang about the home of the brave while battling fears that consumed his daily life. The performance was both his last great triumph and a preview of his final tragedy. He had proven he could still create magic when the moment demanded it, but he could no longer sustain that magic beyond the moment. The gap between his artistic capabilities and his personal struggles had become too wide to bridge except for brief, shining instances like that February afternoon in Los Angeles. Today, when people watch the footage of that performance, they see confidence and swagger. They see an artist completely in control of his craft. What they don't see is the desperation that brought him to that level of emotional honesty. They don't see the man who almost didn't show up because he was afraid his voice wouldn't work. That tension between public triumph and private collapse defined not just the performance, but Marvin's entire final years. He could still deliver greatness when greatness was required, but the cost of summoning that greatness was consuming him from the inside. The NBA All-Star Game performance stands as a monument to both the power of artistic expression and the tragedy of personal destruction. For 2 minutes, Marvin Gaye transformed a patriotic ritual into a soul-bearing confession, and in doing so, he gave America something it didn't know it needed. But he couldn't give himself what he needed, which was peace. In the end, that may be the most honest thing about the performance. Marvin sang about freedom and bravery, not because he possessed them, but because he longed for them so desperately. The beauty in his voice came from the depth of his need, the urgency of his searching for something he would never find. That February day at the Forum, for exactly 2 minutes, Marvin Gaye's suffering became America's anthem. It was the last time his pain would create something larger than itself.